wine and brewing industries, and they explained a few of these compounds, but really, Brettanomyces has been a very understudied organism. I mean, all you guys are sitting here wanting to learn about it, yet if you look at historically the way it's been in brewing, it's been nothing but discussed. It's been a spoilage organism. So it's neat the way that it's working. What research has shown is that precursor compounds come from the raw materials that are being used, so whether it's grapes or whether it's grain, and I mean, that makes sense because where else is it going to come from? The ability to produce various aromatic compounds and flavor compounds, though, varies greatly between strains, and I mean, that makes perfect sense if you think about your wheat beer strain and you think about your California ale strain. It's going to depend on the strain. Brettanomyces is the same way. There's easily as many Brettanomyces as if not twice as much strains or ability for there to be different strains than there are Saccharomyces strains. Saccharomyces is a very domesticated yeast, give or take. Once you start getting to some of your Belgians, your Wits, your Saisons, these are actually much more similar to wild strains than your California or Chico or English ale strains. And Brettanomyces, because of its complex, basically complex genetics, its DNA, it has the ability to have a lot of different strains that can do a lot of things. Volatile phenolics. So this is the one that gets looked at the most, especially because of the wine industry. And it's the best place basically to get the research for it. These are your vinyl glycol, which is your clove-like flavors. So same thing as you get out of some of your Belgian phenolic strains. And also 4-ethyl glycol. And that's taking the vinyl glycol one step further and producing a spicy clove characteristic. Also vinyl phenol and vinyl catechol. All these aromas and flavors are interesting because they've got a synergistic or an additive effect. So while their presence might be really low, overall they come together and kind of make a bigger presence. And it makes it hard to pick out one single characteristic. And the reason why you think about this is because you can limit your phenolic compounds in the beer based on your brewing techniques in the brew house. So the mechanism responsible for these volatile phenolics, two enzymes. One's a decarboxylase. This is the same ones that certain Belgian yeast strains, it's the easiest way kind of to group them into a category. They have this as well, and that's why you get like some of your clove and some of your phenol characteristics. Brettanomyces has a second enzyme, which can then take that vinyl phenol, and it can it's a reductase, and that's what produces the ethyl glycol, ethyl phenol. These are a much more intense characteristic. This is where you get some of the smoky, horsey, and some of the Band-Aid characteristics as well. So depending on how you look at in your homebrew, the flavors that you want to attribute to the beer and you want to make, you can either limit these or you can increase their production. And then the production of esters. So very limited research on esters and the compounds that are produced in those. Some ethyl acetate and ethyl lactate and phenethyl acetate, but these are some of your fruity, solventy, buttery, like rose-like flavors. The research for this was done in the 1970s, and it was really based on sour brewing. So some of these are there because of bacteria that are there, and you needed that first compound, so you needed the acetic acid or the lactic acid. Other than that, it's seen that Brettanomyces decreases isoamyl acetate. Isoamyl acetate is your banana ester. So those of you who don't like the banana, yeah, greatly decrease that. And the other was just a higher concentration of the C8 to C12 fatty acids. So these are your capric acids. One of the biggest things recently is brewers who, and especially home brewers, who have been using Brettanomyces for the fermentation. They talk about pineapple tropical fruit-like aromas. There's nothing of any, there wasn't any research kind of really done into what Brettanomyces does on its own. And that's why, really within the past, say, 5 or less years, a lot of the forefront has been in home brewing. It's inspired some of the professional brewers even to look at what happens in Brettanomyces primary fermentations and try to discover these different tropical fruit pineapple characteristics. That was a big part of actually the research that I did. I was really interested in finding out where these came from. And this is basically just kind of a graph, and there's a bunch of numbers up there and stuff. The ones to look at are the ones with the little asterisks, and you can see the ethyl caproate and ethyl capylate. And these compounds, as you can see down here, were above threshold. And threshold just being that if you tasted it or smelled it, it was to the point where it was actually quite obvious. And so these are a sweet, fruity pineapple characteristic and a musky pineapple, fruity, waxy characteristic. A lot of people have thought possibly it came from ethyl butyrate, because ethyl butyrate is also kind of a tropical fruit characteristic, but that's more kind of a guava papaya type characteristic. So this was kind of some of the first first researched to find numbers this high in any sort of beer. And it would kind of appear that Brettanomyces is capable of producing these capric acids. These are acids that are generally considered kind of goaty, and is able to turn them into esters quickly. This is within 35 days, and produce this fruity sort of pineapple characteristic. Okay, so that was a bunch of science and elaborating on about that. But anyways, it's kind of a good background to be able to look at, to kind of understand then when you are using Brettanomyces, you know, why some of this is going on, kind of what research has shown, and tried to tie it together with some of the things that you're kind of seeing in your fermentation. So I'd like to be able to go over and talk about it. So this is basically how, when I sit down to build a recipe, when I sit down to think about a Brettanomyces beer that I'm going to produce, this is how Crooked Stave is making Brettanomyces beers. And looking at fermentation types, primary fermentation, hybrid mixed fermentation, secondary fermentation, or bottle conditioning. Also raw materials, so you got to look at mouthfeel, you know, malt versus adjuncts, hops, fruit, and then brewing techniques. So there's a lot that can be done in the brew house and how you manipulate how the brew is going to come out through fermentation. So resting, sour mashing, rest temps and times, mash thickness, and sparge temp. And we are using a lot of stainless steel actually to produce Brettanomyces beers. It's a yeast. You can clean it, it dies. It's not a superorganism. But you want to do a good job. So actually recently, this is really interesting. The Brewers Association came out on January 10th with a new category, I would say, for the American style Brett Ale. And this is neat. It's kind of one of the first times that it's brand new. It's being embraced as a style of something that people are starting to do. And it's neat. It really leaves it open to interpretation. And that's one of the things that I want to say being up here that I find so exciting about making beer with Brettanomyces is because no style. There's nothing to go for. I simply build a beer in my mind, and I'm like, this is what I'm going to try and create. And that's neat. That's, you know, creativity. It leaves something open to the imagination. And that's what I think is all of our homebrewing. Is that, you know, in homebrewing sometimes this or that happens. You know, you don't have to follow something. You get to go with your creativity and make 5 gallons at a time, and it's exciting. So a little bit about the style. I mean, come on, it can be very light to black. It can have horsey, goaty, leathery aromas, or it can be fruity. No bourbon or sherry, or vanilla, but full range of hops and bitterness, estery, fruity, no diacetyl or DMS. I mean, really, the sky's the limit with this beer, and that's neat. I don't know if this is going to start getting incorporated into, you know, say like through the AHA as well, and in judging competitions. I would love to see it. I think it would give a lot of people who are producing beers like this a place to put their beers, and for them to be, you know, really considered for what they are. So brewing with Brettanomyces. So this is kind of how I go about when I'm going to make a recipe or when I'm going to, you know, look at the beer I want to do. I deconstruct the beer from finish to start. So I really try and imagine, you know, the beer as though I'm holding it in my hand. I can see it in the glass. You know, does it have a nice head? What color is it? How does it smell when I smell it? How does it taste? And by coming up with that, I can then work backwards to answer all my questions of what I want to put in it. So if it's, say, a cleaner Brettanomyces characteristic I'm after, subtle fruity aromas, maybe light cloves, light tartness, then I'm going to go with primary fermentation. Primary fermentations with Brett are very estery, very fruity. If I'm after funky, stronger, complex characteristics gained through maybe extended aging, secondary fermentation is going to be great. Let the Saccharomyces finish out, and then I'm going to finish it with the Brettanomyces. And the next one is, I think this is kind of the most exciting place to use Brettanomyces is in these mixed fermentations. And this is basically the best of both worlds in my opinion. You get the really good mouthfeel, some of the esters out of your Saccharomyces yeast strains. You also get the attenuation out of it. Maybe sometimes people can have attenuation problems with Brettanomyces. Yet you still get a cleaner, maybe slightly funky, depending on the strain that you use, sort of fermentation from the Brett. And at the same time, you can produce these beers quickly to produce a good Brett beer. And so I like the idea of these kind of hybrid or mixed fermentation Brett beers. Again, though, I mean, it's not black and white. There's many combinations to play around with. In the end, it's going to come down to the raw materials you use, your brewing techniques, and the strains that you choose. Okay, so quickly, Quality control. There's not a lot of quality control in homebrewing. That's nice. You really don't need to employ that. But it is good to use, separately marked, designated equipment. A lot of the equipment we use is porous in homebrewing, and as I said, like Brettanomyces cells are twice as small, if not 4 times as small sometimes, as a Saccharomyces strain, and that allows them to kind of hide away in anywhere where you might have scratched the plastic. Even tubing is porous enough that it can hide away in the tubing and stuff. So as you're kind of retiring equipment, it looks like it's getting junky and old, use it for your sour beers, use it for your Brettanomyces brewing. It's a great idea. If anything, it's just going to add a little bit of character, right? So as you retire it, use it for that. At the same time, though, I do really stress Brettanomyces, it's not a superorganism, it's just a yeast. So it's not going to live over 100 degrees. You can use it, you can clean it, PBW, I used to use caustic. So PBW, things like this, you're able to clean it, you're able to remove it. And the other is heat killing. So if you're looking at your corny kegs and stuff, you're still able to heat kill. The problem is in like the little gaskets and pieces like that. And that's why it's easier just to use separately marked and designated equipment. Unless you don't mind the little, accidental Brett in your IPA, which could be really nice. So heat killing and sterilizing. For anyone who is, sometimes storing some of their yeast and stuff, I recommended media agars, this MYPG, WLN, and this copper sulfate. And I guess it's not so clear on here, but Brettanomyces is an absolutely beautiful organism. It grows really strange cultures. They're really fascinating. And the next is propagation. Is always a good thing to touch on. If you're going to be doing, especially like primary fermentation with the Brett, which is a lot of what my speech is really centered around today and everything, I would highly recommend propagating up an active starter. I can't say for sure, but I think that the amounts of the cells that are available when you buy, from Y yeast and White Labs and stuff, I think that's a little bit more recommended for secondary fermentation. So you really want with Brettanomyces for it to be active. You want to have your proper cell counts. It's really important for primary fermentation, as well as proper cell physiology. Brettanomyces is kind of a finicky organism, so if you can have that where you've just propagated it up, super active, when you pitch into fermentation, it's going to be ready to take off much faster, and you see less of a lag phase. And just higher viability and vitality of the yeast. Sometimes when you get those yeasts, it should be recommended even for Saccharomyces strains. Get it propagated up a little bit, get it growing, get it active, get that physiology level up, and then pitch it into fermentation. So, propagation of Brettanomyces. Same technique is used for Saccharomyces, only more times needed. What you kind of see is, I can show it best on this, over the first 24 hours, you have a bit of a lag phase. This is where you have very minimal growth, almost no activity, and this is with an aerobic culture that you're pumping oxygen into, or you kind of have it on a shaker table. Then over the next kind of up to about 72 to 96 hours, you see a good amount of growth with the cell number coming up, kind of lags out, and then you get another growth phase and another growth phase. And where you're at about 192 hours, you're at about 7 to 8 days right there. And at that point, you still had so much growth in the yeast going. That's about right there at about 192 to 216 is where you want to crop that yeast and then use it in fermentation. Let's go up. Pretty simple equipment needed. All this can be got at the homebrew store, I think, with the exception of a stir plate, which isn't absolutely necessary. So you get your 1 liter Erlenmeyer flask, sterile breathable foam or film just to cover the flask. You still want to exchange O2 and CO2. It's important while it's growing not to have a bunch of CO2 in there, but also to be able to get some O2.